changed for him with this near-death experience. And interestingly, yesterday I had a session with a young woman. She's 31, and 7 years ago her therapist sent her to me, and she had cancer. Her mother had died of cancer at the age of 51, and this was a very serious cancer. And I worked with her, and within 2 weeks, she and I both knew that she was cancer-free. But the doctors were giving her chemo, so they wouldn't do that, wouldn't make a check until they finished the course of chemo. Well, when they finished the course of chemo, she was totally cancer-free. Of course, the doctors all said it was the chemo. And I'm perfectly willing to agree, maybe it was the chemo, I don't know. But I also know what we did. Well, the aftermath of that was the doctors told her she was free of chemo, but that her red blood cell count was so low that she would have to have transfusions. And she came to this session with me. She was crying. She didn't want to have transfusions. She said, "I'm so tired of needles." So I said, "Well, let's work on that, since we don't have to work on the cancer. We'll work on that." So I gave her suggestions that she would, her red blood count would normalize, and the next day she went to the doctor and they took the blood check once more before giving her the transfusions, and her red blood count was normal overnight, believe it or not. Well, she's back because cancer's cropped up again. It's been 7 years. And the doctors themselves say they don't understand it, because with this type of cancer, when it goes into remission, what she had, it's supposed to come back after 15 months. Well, she went 7 years. And we are both convinced now that she is already cancer-free, and she's going to be she's going to call me up next week when she'll be checked out. So we'll see what happens there. But she told me the same thing. She's a very bright young girl. She graduated from the University of Wisconsin, has a very responsible job with one of the biggest banks in the state, Marshall and Italy Bank. Not as a teller, she's in charge of publicity of some kind, and one of their key people. And she said, and while she was going on this chemo thing, she took a leave of absence for 3 months. And she said to me yesterday, she said, "I feel so different." She said, "I don't feel like all those other people out there." You know, for the second time, she's had this really life-threatening disease. She said, I don't feel like them at all. She said, "Is this all there is to go to work, go to a job, and to try to get advancements, have a big career, make as much money, and get as much authority as you can get?" And she said, "Is that all that there is?" And I said, "No, it's not all that there is. There's a lot more." And she said, "I feel much more interested in trying to help people." And she said, "I know I can do it." She said, my grandmother came down a little while ago, and this is her mother's mother. Well, the granddaughter had lost this girl's mother, and now the girl's aunt, the other daughter of this 83-year-old woman, died. And she said nobody knew what to say to her. Everybody was embarrassed. She said, "But I wasn't. I talked to her, and she said, I know that I helped her." Fine. Well, this is, what's opening up for her as a result of this near-death experience. Yeah.
Would you mind sharing what you used? Did you use like a process or an end
What?
result? A process imagery or end result imagery with her cancer?
For the cancer,
Yeah.
I used both. I used the Simonton method of, that's, you know, Simonton's book, Getting Well Again. Well, you should read that. That's a classic. That's the book that Simonton published around, at the late 70s, or around 1980, I think just before. It's called Getting Well Again. Do you know Simonton? You don't know
No,
about-
no.
Well, Simonton is a radiologist, I believe, and he and his then wife, his wife was a psychologist, who was interested in guided imagery and stuff like that. And of course, he had all the scientific know-how. And he set up a clinic in Texas where he would accept only terminal cancer cases. Cancer cases were sent from all over the country, but they had to be adjudged terminal by the physicians. So here he has and he worked with X number of patients over the years that he was collecting information for this book. And the figures that he published as a result of his work, which I'll tell you what his work is like, were that 50% of the terminal patients went into remission.
Cool.
And of the other 50 who died, who were supposed to die anyway, who didn't go in remission, their lifespan was increased 300% over the prognosis. So here, if it was a person who said you only got a year to live, they lived for 3. They said you have only 2 months to live, they lived for 6 months. Now those are the figures. And some people lived 5 or 6 times beyond, and some lived maybe double, but the average was 3 times. And that's only the 50% who didn't go into remission. 50% went into remission. Now that's an ungodly high amount. And he used, you're probably familiar with the methods he used. He has the method of visualization, visualizing the cancer as a mass of, he calls it half-rotted hamburger meat. He talks in those terms to emphasize that the cancer cells themselves have no power. They don't have power. The only threat that they pose to the body is their incredibly rapid rate of expansion. In other words, the immune system doesn't control the expansion, so they just expand until you're all hamburger meat and you die. I mean, sufficiently dead hamburger meat. So you view the cancer as being helpless and weak and ineffective to do anything in itself except to multiply. Now you view the immune system as being a series of schools of white blood cells, which is the way it works. You know, there are the hunter cells and the killer cells, and then the cleanup cells, they're called macrophages. And the hunter cells are going through the blood constantly. When they find either a cancerous cell or a bacterium of some kind, anything foreign, and a cancerous cell they experience as foreign, they immediately release a signal. They release a chemical signal into the blood, which causes all the other white blood cells to congregate. And the T cells, or the killer cells, sting and explode cancerous cells, and they actually do that. And I have actually seen, because France Doyle used to bring to some of the workshops photographs that she had, and she would give a little lecture on it. They're these marvelous micro photos. They're photographs which are taken under a microscope. And so you would see a big slide up on the screen, and here would be a cancer cell about that big, and here would be a white blood killer cell about that big, killing it. You could actually see that. I have seen that. And then the third thing is the macrophages. Macro in Greek means large, big, and like the macrocosm as opposed to the microcosm. And phage means to eat. So the big eaters. And those cells are larger cells, and each one has several little openings which are actually mouths. And they go up to these cells which have been exploded, and they engulf. They open their mouth and take it inside, and they have a fluid in them, a digestive fluid, which digests the cancer cell.
So actually the cancer is transformed.
What?
The cancer is actually transformed. Because they digest it and then it's acceptable to the body. Yeah.
Yeah, and they so that that's what happens. But what happens is that you can see on the pictures, and I have also seen pictures of a macrophage engulfing a piece of cancer. That's exactly how it does. Now, what Simonton did, he took that knowledge of that functioning, and he made process imagery out of that. And you know what process imagery is as opposed to end result imagery. He told you to visualize the cancer cells as being a hunk of half-rotted hamburger meat, and then all these other cells swarming in, finding it, sending the signal, stinging it, exploding it, gulping it, and digesting it. And that's the process. Now, if the person is having chemo, for example, there's an additional process. You visualize the medicine coming in as a stream of golden arrows, just thousands of them, like a whole army of archers had released a volley of arrows in there, and they're killing the cancer cells. And that's what chemo does, of course. It literally kills the cancer cells. And because the cancer cells are weaker than the normal cells, the chemo, although it weakens normal cells, doesn't actually kill them. It kills the cancer first. And so that's the imagery that Simonton uses. Then he also he reinforces that by the use of art therapy, of drawing pictures, and he encourages people to go inside and look for images of their own, and so they come up with images of, and it can be stick figures, or it can be designs, or it can be lightning and the rain washing away the debris. It can be anything, but he encourage them to do drawing, to do that. And then he also does the end result imagery after you have seen the cancer being destroyed. You see it getting littler and littler until you see nothing but unbroken, healthy tissue, pink cells, and that's the end result. You look at the end result. He uses both. Well, that's what Simonton used, and I certainly suggest you read his book. Have you read it? Have you,
Sounds fascinating, though.
Get it. Carl Simonton, Getting Well Again. Now, his methods have been followed by a man named Bernie Siegel.
Yeah.
And Siegel says, well, he says he doesn't like the idea of the body attacking itself. Well, because the cancer says it's part of your body. Well, it's not. It has become a foreign object. And actually what happens is the immune system does attack it. It does attack it. So I don't much, in my experience with this, of course, the first time I was asked to work with cancer was about 1972, when I was at Cambridge House, and a woman who had been, Al Lowen, who was my teacher in bioenergetics, had recommended to her that she come down to see me. She lived in Green Bay. And she came down and she had the cancer, and I just worked with her bioenergetically. But I also did imagery on my own, which Lowen hadn't suggested, because I was a hypnotist before I learned bioenergetics, and I was a Gestalt therapist doing dream work, saying, be the engine, be the lightning, you know, actually doing a kind of eidetic imagery work before I met Lowen, so I was already doing that. And that woman went into remission, and then very quickly developed something else and died of a bowel obstruction. And so she died, but she did not die of cancer. The cancer was in remission. And she was really wanted to die because while she was in the hospital with bowel obstruction, she got a friend to deliver a lot of morphine to her, and she took an overdose and tried to kill herself, but didn't take enough. So she didn't kill herself. And I went up to Green Bay and I saw her, and she died sometime after that, but not from the cancer. And then the second case was about 4 years later, around 76. A woman who developed it and absolutely refused to have surgery or chemo. She was going to do it, you know, without any of that, which I didn't encourage her to do because I wouldn't take that responsibility. But I worked with her, and she went into remission, and she's still in remission, and this has been 20 years. And the third case came in about 78. When I first went to California, and they brought a woman to the group because she had cancer and was dying of it. And so I thought, gee, I better find out about some of this stuff. And then I heard about Simonton's book, which was just new then, and I read the book. Well, then I used his methods. And she went into remission. And in the course of about 4 years, she went into remission. She came back, and she went into remission and came back. And she went into remission, and something else developed, and she again died, but not of cancer. And then I had an experience a couple of years later after that in California with a man who was declared terminal. And I was asked to go to his house because he couldn't travel to where I was, I mean in a car. He had a lot of pain, and so I went to his house, and I gave him the Simonton stuff and told him to buy the book and read the book, and so that he would really know how to do it and do these things every day. Well, in 2 weeks, he was totally cancer-free, completely. Now, I checked on him a couple of years ago, and he was still cancer-free. In fact, his psychiatrist who was terrified of AIDS, made an appointment with me. And I don't know whatever happened there. But at any rate, this man was a homosexual. And he may have had AIDS. I don't know that. Because at that point, AIDS was very, very new. They were just talking about it. Just talking about it. But the guy is still alive, as far as I know. Then I had another interesting experience. I talked about this remission in California when I was on the East Coast. And I got a phone call, and a woman said, I'm one of Dr. Rothman's patients, and Dr. Rothman told me you had been talking about a book, and Dr. Rothman couldn't remember the name of the book. I said, yeah. I told her it's Getting Well Again by Carl Simonton. She said, well, my mother has been declared terminal with cancer, and both she and I are determined we're not going to let it happen. How's that for an attitude? So they were just desperate. They were just doing everything. So she got the book. Well, about 6 months later, I was doing a workshop out there again, and this woman, her name was so-and-so, she said, you don't remember my name, do you? I said, no, I don't. She said, well, I called you up. My mother was sick, had cancer. And you gave me the name of Carl Simonton's book. I said, oh, yes, what happened? Well, she said, I got the book, and my mother and I both read it, and I helped her with all the exercises and so on, and she is free of cancer. Just from reading the book and following it, you see. So, and I've had other cases where people have gone into remission. So, there is something at work. I mean, there is a way of working. And I read an article in the journal, Milwaukee Journal, just this past week about prayer. Does cancer help prayer? Well, they've got all these cases where it has. But then an oncologist here, a very prominent doctor, said, well, there's absolutely no proof of any kind, no scientific proof that cancer helps, that can be helped by prayer. Of the cases that apparently have been helped, it was misdiagnosed, they didn't have it in the first place. 2, the medicine did it and they attribute it to the medicine. Or 3, it's a spontaneous remission that no one can explain. Well, now...
But they can prove that it's spontaneous.
They can prove that it's spontaneous, but they can't see. If they give them a drug and there's remission, they'll say the drug caused the remission. If they operate and it doesn't come back for 5 years, they say, well, we got all of it, and through surgery we eliminated the cancer. But if there's prayer, or something like what we're talking about here, which is related to prayer, if that happens and the cancer goes away, they either say it was misdiagnosed, or I had the case of that first got me interested in Native American practices that I've told you about, I think, of the Maria back in about 73 or so, 72. About 73, I think, who had cancer of the bone in her right foot, and they were going to amputate the knee to be sure to get all of it. And she had to use crutches. She could not walk without crutches. And her fiance, it's a long story, I won't go into that, made a connection with these Indians on a Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And she said, I won't go in for surgery, I'm going to go out here and do this. And Of course, they tried to dissuade her, but they couldn't force her, and so they went. And she had 2 nights of ceremonies, 2 nights, and she came back from there, left her crutches on the reservation after 2 nights, came back, went to the hospital, they checked her out, there was no cancer. They said the machine isn't operating, it's malfunctioning. So they checked the machine, it was not malfunctioning. They said, well, you were misdiagnosed. Can you imagine they were going to cut her leg off at the knee?
Yeah.
I mean, that's asinine. She was not misdiagnosed. It's asinine.
Well, this last weekend I heard Larry Dossey talk.
Who?
Larry Dossey?
Dossey, yeah.
Yeah, it was the Institute for Alternative Medicine,
Yeah.
part of the National Institute of Health. And he said basically, as he's talking as a doctor, he said basically doctors have case histories which are things that fit their belief system,
Yeah.
and anecdotes,
Yeah.
which are the unexplainable. But he said there was a double-blind study in which people, that the doctors, the nurses, the people running the study, and the patients, I mean, it was like 400 patients that were all divided up, that were diagnosed with cancer, and so the names went out to prayer groups to pray for, and they were the only people that had the names were the prayer groups. And they did all the medicine was the same, and there was a significant difference. He said it was enough that if it was a medicine that you could have a patent on,
Yeah.
you know, it would have
Yeah.
been proclaimed in all the medical journals, but because it was prayer
Yeah. Yeah.
and therefore it couldn't be controlled
It's- it's-
and bottled.
There's no proof, you know.
Yeah.
Well, scientism, we've talked about that, the difference between science and scientism. People call themselves scientists, or say they're scientific, but they're scientistic. Scientism is that practice which says the only proof that you can have of anything, or the only results that are significant, are those that can be weighed, measured, and replicated. Well, even though you can replicate, you could do another study and find similar results you could replicate, you still can't weigh and measure it. And that is just scientism. And of course, modern physics, which is in the very cutting edge of science, this is Einstein and Max Planck and Schrödinger and people like that. And more recently, this man who just died at London University, Michael Bohm, with his holographic theory of reality. They all tell you that there is no such thing as an objective experiment, because the experiment, the outcome of the experiment, is influenced by the experimenter, by what he expects or fears or hopes. And this is in working with the atom. This is not working with something like how do people feel. This is working with the atom. And the atom can either, I mean, the reality can either be waves of energy, or they can be little tiny particles of matter. And they're one or the other. But they're one now, and now they're the other. They suddenly, it's the same thing suddenly is something else. And it is definitely connected with the who's doing the experiment. And so, well, that simply gives a kind of legitimacy to some of this subjective stuff that we're doing, like journeying. I had an experience that I'll tell you about. It was very significant this past weekend. I was in what they call Focus 15, which is very advanced so advanced that they don't even want to talk about it much. And I had dedicated the work I was doing with this tape to the intention was I intend to learn how I can integrate and coordinate everything I have been learning in this weekend in such a way as to maximize peace of mind, awareness of beauty, and health in myself and in those around me that I touch, that I deal with. That was the purpose. And we went into this Focus 15, as they call it. They're great on all these technical numbers and so on, which is all right because it gives you a handle on it. And I was in this expanded state of consciousness, vastly expanded, and I took that as my intention and I threw it out into the void. And immediately I saw an image. Now, the image was ordinary enough. I immediately saw some kind of vase, which was so nondescript that I can't even see it right now, except it was not bright in color and so on. It was sort of ordinary. And there was a bouquet in it, and the bouquet was mostly leaves. It wasn't leaves like that are where you could see spaces, but it was just a lot of little leaves. It was very dense, like you couldn't put your hand through it or something. And then there were a lot of blue flowers, masses of blue flowers. Mm. And they weren't big showy flowers, they were little small flowers, but so many of them that you got this impression of blue masses. Mm. Now, what is this? It's an ordinary enough image. But I had with it this feeling of significance. I had with it this feeling, that's it. I had no idea of what that was, but I just had that feeling of significance. And I felt a sense of gratitude because I knew that sooner or later, just as in the imagery that came to me when I had the polymyalgia in '91, even though I didn't understand it, I knew this was going to help me. And as you all know, in 2 weeks, my SED rate dropped from 70 to dropped 50 points down to 20, without having any idea what the hell the image was all about. So, we've been told you can ask repeated questions. You get an answer. You can then ask the question, what does this mean? I want clarification, and throw that out. So I just formed that. I want to know what this means. Is there some way in which I can understand this? And I threw that out. And immediately came back to me, simultaneously, a Sufi proverb, which I think I quoted in here to you, or quoted, some of you have heard me say it. A Sufi proverb, the apparent is the bridge to reality. That came, and with it, simultaneously, like in another, like this came here and this came here, and they both came at the same time, was this sudden knowledge that the way to, that the meaning of this bouquet, how can I coordinate and utilize all this stuff, lay in looking at whatever was apparent before me more closely. That just by looking closely I would see it. And of course I've been doing that, as you know, instinctively, because last time I was asking you to look at the plant and bang, I mean, this incredible verification. I had struck on that method of doing this, and I thought, well, this is, and I've been doing this with clients, you know, in my office and in groups, and doing it myself. But this verification of this, and it all seems like the most simple, logical thing in the world. Of course, the way to coordinate this stuff is to look more closely and see what you're missing. Make yourself open to what's there in addition. So that was a profound experience for me. You know, that was in the same class with what I saw when I was at Esalen, and I asked for the image that had to do with my sickness. So, well, that's a pretty lengthy way of telling you where I'm at. So, any question on that? Is this of interest to you?
Mm-hmm.
I thought it would be, otherwise I wouldn't take the time to talk about it at length like this. So.
It's interesting that you saw a flower this time, because when you were telling us about the experience when you were 19 and that you were also imaging,
That's
you were
correct.
looking at a rose, I believe, or some
Narcissus.
flower.
I was looking at the narcissus.
Oh, narcissus. Yeah, well, it was a flower. Yeah.
Potted narcissus. Yes, that's true. That's and I hadn't realized that, and I realize now that on 2 other occasions there have been flowers. One in 1960. When I looked up and saw this enormous old apple tree. It was an apple tree that must have been nearly 100 years old. It had a trunk this big around, enormous, and it was up, 30 feet high, great big. I mean, the lowest branches you couldn't even reach with your hand. It was a full-size tree. Maiden blush apples. Old 19th century apple, which you can't even buy anymore. And I looked up and saw this mass of flowers, and I thought to myself, God, here is this incredibly blue sky and this mass of, this is so beautiful, and I'm not responding to it.
What more is there?
What more is there? And I closed my eyes and I made exactly the same prayer that I did when I was 19 with the narcissus, and I opened my eyes. And everything was very still. Just like that. And all of a sudden, just this incredible light and incredible joy. So yes, you're right. That's, the flowers seem to, Well, so that was the payoff after my experience with becoming the victim of the police in search of a murderer.